God have mercy on us all.
Did I screw that up?
And you can get Listen Up for only $14.99.
Well, we're really delighted that you're here and being able to interview you and talk about your new book, or your book, one of your children that is running around this universe that's being a blessing to the church and people. And so, yeah, we're delighted. We have, I think all of us kind of have a connection through Duke. And so I don't know if you want to talk about that some and have Warren talk about it.
I guess I'll start a little bit, just to kind of let all of our listeners know. Today we're talking with Dr. Warren Kinghorn, who's a psychologist and theological ethicist, working at the Center of Religious Communities and caring for persons with mental health problems, and talks about how Christians can engage in practices of modern healthcare, which I think is really relevant for what we want to talk about today. You are jointly appointed to be a faculty member of Duke Divinity School and the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Duke University Medical Center. And you teach, or you are the co-director of Theology, Medicine, and Culture, which just had a wonderful conference around practice and presence that I got to hang out for a few days and really engage with health practitioners and theologians as well. But also you practice your medicine at the DA. Gosh, how do we edit this?
We don't.
Go all the way back.
It's like SNL.
He practices psychiatry at the Durham VA. Practices medicine at the Durham VA Medical Center.
Wow.
So we're so glad to have you on the show today with you.
Seems like you're still underperforming in life, Warren. I wish you did more in this world. Just reading.
Hey, it's really great to be with both of you. Thank you.
Such a gift. Can you talk to us just a bit about how this book came to being and why you decided to write it and the passion for you behind that and all that? Yeah.
Well, thanks for inviting me on and for reading the book and for the chance to talk about it. Well, I think the answer to your question is I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm now, I guess, generously called mid-career. I've been out of residency now for about a little over 15 years, and I love the practice of psychiatry. I love being a physician. I love specifically working in mental health. I love the chance to sit with people and to walk with people and just the privilege of being invited into some of the most difficult time of people's lives and the most vulnerable spaces of their lives, and to be able to walk with them. And I know that you all as pastors also in those kinds of situations. And that's really a blessing. And I love actually a lot of the things that we can do in psychiatry, the treatments that we can offer and the kind of systems that we have. And also I've grown discontent as a psychiatrist about the ways that psychiatry as a field sometimes, instead of really focusing on the whole person and being attentive to stories, it can kind of dissect people into collections of symptoms and make people feel like what psychiatrists care about is applying techniques and technologies to reduce symptoms in ways that actually doesn't get to the fullness of who people are. And so this book is in part my hope as a Christian to be able to speak into that, about like what psychiatry and mental health care can be and what Christians are called to be as we think about mental health and mental illness.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
I mean, I really took away kind of from the book just how this metaphor for people today and how we look at mental health is very much mechanistic, that we are like machines, and that you as provider can fix my machine or have, what have you, but that approach doesn't go maybe necessarily far enough into addressing like who we are as human beings. And I just found that really, really fascinating, because so often, at least on the church side of things, like it's a different depth to walk alongside of people having mental health issues, who are in the midst of struggle.
Right.
And I don't want to turn them away and just say, well, there's a doctor for you to see, but I also don't know how to really to go beyond that, right? And so I felt like that was a really helpful kind of dichotomy to see that sometimes we just put people in these categories that we can fix you, but that's really not helpful for how we understand people.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's important as you think about engaging mental health in churches to recognize there is a place for psychologists and psychiatrists and trained mental health clinicians. And I think the best way to think about what we do in the world of mental health care is like we're trained for many years and in different disciplines to be able to walk with people in really difficult and complex situations. And so when it comes to living with a history of trauma, when it comes to really difficult or maybe abusive relationships, when it comes to experiences that people don't understand or are confused by, whether that's changes in mood or changes in thought or changes in memory, especially when it comes to thoughts of suicide, then I think that's the kind of thing that trained mental health clinicians have a lot to offer. They have practice in helping walk with people through those kinds of situations. And so there is a role for clinicians, but it's not like mental health. Thinking about mental health should be exclusively the province of clinicians, as if pastors and just people in churches, shouldn't feel like they have anything meaningful to say about mental health and how mental health is talked about and is treated. I mean, for one thing, a whole lot of mental health struggles that bring people into therapists' offices are things like depression, anxiety, problems with relationships, and a lot of that has to do with the way that we live in the world, with our relationships, with feeling disconnected from others, with feeling disconnected from ourselves, with feeling disconnected from God. And so if we think that anytime we talk about mental health, we only should be doing it if we have some kind of degree and license, then I think we neglect a lot of the ways that a lot of mental health problems are a matter of, like, what does it mean for people to belong in a community?
Yeah,
what does it mean for people to understand the story of their life? What does it mean for them to have a meaningful vocation and things to do and a sense of purpose? And none of those are explicitly medical concepts or issues.
Right. I think about the something you do within the book is like even just the beginning of that the medical model and beginning to see it that often and we do this I think also in the church. We have a different model, but we're working off these mental models, and so when people come into our office, often we see them through the lens that we have been crafted and formed by, right? And I think that there's a limit to the various models that we have access to. And what I am loving about what you're doing here is that there seems to be an expansion of both. There's gifts within those models because we can see certain things. They give language to certain things, and that language gives us access to story. But often, like John Swinton has said, that often a diagnosis is when I go to a professional and I tell them my story, and then they hand it back to me, right? Yeah. And there's both a joy in that and a limitation in that. And so,
I mean, diagnosis is a kind of story. And when I write in the book about what I call the machine metaphor for mental health care, it's a particular way of telling a story. So people who are patients by the fact that they're in my office as a psychiatrist will come to me and they'll talk about unwanted experiences, unwanted emotions, confusing experiences. And as a psychiatrist, like I'm trained to say, oh, I recognize what you're describing. What you're describing are symptoms. So I re-narrate their experience as symptoms. I say, well, these are symptoms of a particular diagnosis or a particular disorder, like major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or whatever it is. And then I say, okay, well, let me offer you this diagnosis as a way of explaining or understanding your symptoms. And then I can reach into my toolbox of evidence-based treatments, whether it's medications or referral for psychotherapy or other things, and let's see if we can help reduce those symptoms. And there's a lot of good things about that.
Yes.
It's actually really helpful when somebody has been acting in ways that they don't understand, other people don't understand, to say, hey, there's a story here that can help make sense of what is going on with you. It's called bipolar disorder. or post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, here's how people respond when they have this collection of experiences. And that can be really helpful, because if you can label something and name something, then you can know how to respond. And that can lead to really helpful and life-giving treatments. That's the positive side. On the negative side, people can get kind of locked into that medical story. Like I have bipolar disorder, or I have PTSD, or I have depression, where diagnosis becomes identity, where people have a hard time understanding themselves outside of the symptoms that they have and the diagnoses that they carry. And that can actually, I think, prevent people from knowing what can really be healing. And so we have to always think about, like, the medical story is one kind of story. It can be a really helpful kind of story, but it's not the only story. And it's not the deepest truth of the story of our lives.
I love that.
And so I think always putting things in perspective, like, when is the story helpful and when is it not, is really important and helpful.
Yeah. I mean, that also makes me think about how, even in Scripture, you think of how community uses that diagnosis, that title, that name, kind of, that we become legion, right? That we can self-identify with whatever the diagnosis is, but then when the community holds that over us too, it becomes another limiting narrative factor, and we get stuck in these, I mean, literally caves, tombs, chained into that, when community identifies or sees us as other.
That's right.
Yeah. When you are depression, or you are schizophrenia, or you are OCD, and that's how people see ourselves and other people see you. And of course, it's not the fault of somebody who's diagnosed that other people adopt that way of seeing. I mean, that's the way that stigma often functions. But it's important that we be able to tell broader, and I think more nuanced, and in some cases truer stories about ourselves and others than simply our diagnoses.
Yeah. One of the hopes that I have in your writing is that there's some more border crossing that happens between psychiatry and theology and community and anthropology. These things that have understood their domains in certain geographic locations, so to speak, within the mind. But it seems that psychologists and psychiatrists are getting at something that often a really good shepherd is getting at a bit of something else, has different language, a different experience, and that often we've sent say what you've just described, to say the man of the tombs comes to my office and says, my name is Legion, for we are many. Right? So out of my own toolbox, I might send him to you. And a psychiatrist that say, okay, I know this will reduce the symptoms of these types of voices in your head. Take this medication and maybe do some cognitive behavioral therapy, and then come back to me, and also go see Matt or Andrew, maybe even a better person, right? And so they come back to us, and we say, okay, Legion. But part of what I understand that story in Matthew possibly is that this gentleman could have experienced a deep sexual trauma within the legion of Roman guards that had taken station, and he had identified himself with that trauma, right? Being able to have that broken down and being in conversation with you as a pastor, almost like what you would do in a hospital when you are a new therapist being trained, that you have a team of people you're talking to about a certain, I'm hopeful that maybe this could be a part of the church's function going forward.
Yeah,
maybe
I think you're right. Listen, I love the story of the man in the tombs.
Me too.
I read about it in the book. I talk about it with my students, because it always messes with my, like, boxes that I put people in my medical training. We read about this man, and one is that, just the narrative of Scripture, he didn't need a doctor. Like, he needed Jesus to liberate him and deliver him. And so this is not primarily a medical story. But when I think about the man in the tombs, what kind of, it was a healing. Jesus healed him, but what kind of healing was this? Like, we can see it as a kind of medical healing, but the text itself, there's not a lot of evidence in the text itself that this man had what we would now consider a psychotic disorder. even though that's what a lot of people assume. I think as you're saying, some have suggested maybe he was a military veteran, maybe he was a combat veteran. There's a really interesting book chapter I read that makes that case.
Yes.
We don't know we do know that he was restrained, and a lot of people in our mental health system understand that, as well as people that are incarcerated understand that. We know that he was perceived as having difficulty with control. We know that he was hitting himself and cutting himself with stones, and so he was harming himself. So these are concerning things, but we don't really know what kind of diagnosis he would have had, but we can see it as a kind of medical healing. You can also certainly see it, most straightforwardly, it's a spiritual healing. Like the man was oppressed by this legion of unclean spirits, and Jesus cast them out. And I make the point when I talk with students about this, like we tend to shy away from the language of the demonic in our culture, and we tend to see it as metaphor or something else. But the demons and unclean spirits at the time of Jesus would have been understood as not only very real, but just part of the world, like just taken for granted that we live and breathe amidst like a world of forces that are broader than we are. And so that would not have been something that people would have doubted or would have had much even question about. But it's important to look at how the demons work in the New Testament, and including in this story, that they don't tend to be seen as afflicting people that are already privileged and powerful. Like the demons tend to for whatever reason in Scripture, in the healing narratives, the demons tend to latch themselves onto people that are already vulnerable, that are already on the margins, and to make them even more vulnerable. So in our modern, sociological speak, we might talk about compounded vulnerability. Like the demons pick on those that are already on the margins.
Deaths of despair.
Exactly. So when Jesus is casting out this legion of demons, I mean, it's not only a statement that Jesus is Lord over the demons, but it's a rescue of somebody who is as far on the margins of his society as he could have gotten, living among the dead. So it's a medical healing, it's a spiritual healing. You can see it as a kind of political healing, given that the only word for legion at that time would have been for this brigade level, several thousand Roman soldiers. And so, why did the people of the village command Jesus to leave their presence? Maybe because they were a little worried about what Rome would do after he just humiliated this legion. And then, of course, you can see it as a relational healing. The man is seen as being he's restored to his community. Yes. And he actually, in Mark's account, he actually asks Jesus to stay with them and go back across the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus says, no, I want you to stay among your people and tell what the Lord has done for you. And others have pointed out that it was this man who lived in the tombs, who became the first apostle to the Gentiles.
Yes. Yep.
First missionary to the Gentiles was this man. And so I think it's really remarkable, actually, to think about the breadth of healing in this story relative to the narrow account of healing that we often have in our modern ways of thinking.
I love that. I love that phrase in Mark where it says that he was restored and in his right mind. And I think any of us that have ever dealt with any mental health issues, to be in your right mind feels there's something profound about that, clothed and in his right mind, right? Yeah. And Jesus doesn't carry a bunch of clothes around in a backpack. I mean, somebody clothed this guy. He was restored to a community.
Yeah. And he was restored in relationship. Yeah. There's a really beautiful sermon that the political or opinion columnist Michael Gerson preached at Washington's National Cathedral. Okay. Gerson passed away from cancer several years ago, but he talked about his own experience of being hospitalized with depression and how much that particular phrase meant to him. It's easily findable on the web, and it's a really beautiful account of somebody just wrestling with faith and faith in the midst of a lot of suffering.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I think the piece that continues to point out to me as being so profound too is the communal piece, is the way that Jesus doesn't take him on the journey, but Jesus leaves him with the people who knew him, with the community that would have been a part of his upbringing and kind of know those stories, and I think that is such an important part of this way that the church wrestles with how we deal with mental health, is that like oftentimes it's people who trust the church, right? It's people who have been members for ever and ever and ever, and this might be like the last ditch opportunity. Maybe the church will be there for me, and I really feel like that is so powerful, that the church is a community that we can trust, or the church is a place where maybe there's something more. But community kind of has a profound role in all of that.
That's right. I think the story also calls us not to give up on people. That Mark's account of the story of Legion ends that everybody was left amazed. And you can imagine that this guy would have had family. He probably had a mom who was really worried about him, and they were wondering, like, what can be done? Is there anything that's ever going to turn his life around? And then he found healing, and he was back. And I think that it's a good word for us to never give up hope, that people who are really struggling to find their way, or struggling with relationships or choices or mental illness, to never give up hope that people can be restored and can be known in community and can find a better way. And I think the story just always calls us to just keep that.
Is there a way, and I see you doing this and helping the church and actually the medical world, but often, as you've noted, that a diagnosis can be a clustering of symptoms and things that happen inside of a person, right? And so often, because of our individual sense of self, there's individual diagnoses and then an individual treatment plan, right? And so you are deemed by then the mental health folks as walking a good path if you are compliant to medication, to treatment structure, to these kinds of things, right? And so it's deeply individualistic, and I think that misses this relational, this cultural, this dynamic thing that we've atomized ourselves, individualized the plan, and pushed it all down to the individual. And I wonder if, like canaries in a cave, in a mine,
Absolutely.
If it's not something in the zeitgeist of our culture that we have to also attend to with a veracity that we're not.
Yeah. It's not a scientific book; it's a journalistic book. But I love the book "Lost Connections" by the journalist Johann Hari, and he writes about depression and anxiety. Yes. And he starts out by saying, as a young man in the UK, British journalist, that he experienced depression, sought care within the NHS in England, took antidepressant medication, and he says, the medicines were fine, like they helped some. He's not anti-medication, but he said they never really seemed to get to the core of the problem. And I began to wonder about my experience and like how that was framed as like that my depression was something inside me that had to do with things that were broken in my brain, and I needed to have my neurotransmitters, set in a different balance. And he said, I came to ask the question, like, what if the epidemic of depression and anxiety in our culture, which is really an epidemic, it's the kind of thing that we're seeing all around us, all across the U.S. and Europe. What if the epidemic of depression and anxiety in our culture is not because our genes have changed or because our brains are dramatically changing, but because we live in a culture that no longer meets our basic psychological needs? And what if it's specifically, Hari says, that we find ourselves like not connected, but disconnected from other people.
Yes.
And he has a whole set of chapters on it, from a healthy and secure future, from the natural world around us, from childhood trauma, from status and respect. And he keeps going. And as a psychiatrist, when I first read that, and I thought that feels right to me, because so many of my patients at the VA are experiencing profound disconnection from themselves, from others, from their own, from the land, from their bodies, but also that account makes me excited as a Christian too, because
Yes.
I think like if the way to think about engaging depression and anxiety in our culture in a broad way is through seeking reconnection of those things that have been disconnected, like helping people to connect with one another and with vocation and purpose and with the natural world around, and with status and respect, then that is a fantastic like remit for the church. It's exactly what the church is able to do, and frankly can do better than any healthcare system can. So it made me excited about that.
That's beautiful. That really is. Because I think that there's, like, when I, times in my life when my anxiety has been really engaged, I ask helping professionals certain questions, which is basically around, help me reduce this. Why do I feel so this inside, right? Where I wonder if like the soulful question underneath that, or questions you've asked in this book, like do I matter? Am I loved? Why do I belong? Like that is the epicenter of a lot of my anxiety, whether I want to voice that question or not, right?
And anxiety, I mean, I talk about it in the book. I think St. Thomas Aquinas, whose work I draw on in the book, would affirm this too. Sometimes anxiety is just the body functioning in overdrive. There can be things happening with our endocrine system. There could be things happening that sometimes anxiety can just happen without any clear referent. But most of the time, and especially in a kind of culture that is just an anxious culture where there's so much anxiety all around, most of the time anxiety does mean something. And the way that Aquinas understood, and there's a lot of different, I think, ways that could show up. I don't mean to be simplistic about it, but when Thomas Aquinas, writing, 700, 800 years ago, talked about the emotions, he said, and I'm highly simplifying here, but he said emotions aren't just these like experiences that our body creates that don't mean anything that we have to just kind of deal with. Emotions happen as signposts that point us in some ways to the structure of what we love and of what we are revulsed by, which is the inverse of what we love. And so you would say that that if we're anxious, that one real possibility is that we love someone or something that we want to pursue, and we perceive that there's a block to attaining the object of our love, and so that fear or anxiety comes along from this perceived obstacle or block, like, and that could look lots of different ways. It could be like, I really want to be accepted by this group of people, but this obstacle is getting in the way, so I'm anxious. It could be, I really want to be economically secure, but there's this obstacle, and I'm anxious. It could be any number of different things. So attending to, like, what opportunities are there to learn from our anxiety about what it is that we really truly love, and by attending to what we love, we can help learn more about what it means to live fully in the world, and that can, I think, help us understand our anxiety, but also like live with it and navigate it. That's not like a quick solution, but it's a kind of way to orient ourselves. Of it.
I love that idea. I back in seminary, I remember one of the most profound and like hard realities to understand. We had to do spiritual practices, and so we had to try out different things as seminarians, and one of them was like Sabbath rest, and so took it very literally, like shut everything off at the house, totally disconnected, quiet, and I was living by myself, and so I found that it was absolutely disorienting and unhelpful. But like the minute that I kind of shifted that practice toward seeing Sabbath as just resting with friends or resting with my community, it was more restorative than just no electricity, no anything. And there's just there's something about that where I think I found that sometimes getting back to the things that nurture you, the things that help reorient you, can take a different shape than maybe what we imagine they're supposed to be, right? That this is what Sabbath rest looks like, so I have to go this direction. It's really refinding myself in God. It's refinding myself in relationships that bring a deeper sense of who I am, and kind of that, like the passion or the emotion that I have towards what God is calling me to participate in this world. Yeah. Well, tell us again your definition of beatitude, or in the book you describe beatitudo as like the participation in God's divine plan or something like that. I thought it was super helpful as I thinking about living out faith in a world that can be so hard to navigate.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I do draw on the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a philosopher and theologian who lived in the 1200s. And there's a variety of reasons I use Aquinas in the book, but mainly because he has this really beautiful image of like, who are we as human beings? Like, what's our basic identity as human beings? And his answer is that we are God's beloved creatures. God knows us and loves us, and we're made in God's image. And he also saw us at our core as wayfarers on a journey. So we're God's creatures. We come from God, and he believed that we're on a journey on our way to God or back to God, like into God's life. So our life in this world is a kind of journey from God as our creator to God as our hope and our goal and our joy. And so that gives us a frame of like, we're on a journey. And so what do we need for the journey? And that's the central question I think that we can ask ourselves at any stage in life, and also in the midst of mental health challenges. But the question is, where are we going? And Aquinas had this understanding of where we're going, that the Latin word would be beatitudo, so very similar to like the Beatitudes. And it's hard to translate that in modern English because it's a complex concept and word. You might translate it as happiness, but it's not just an emotion. You might translate it as flourishing, which is, I think, closer. But it's important to note that it wasn't just any kind of flourishing, like a plant might flourish on its own. It had specifically to do with like growing deeper and participating more and more fully in the life of God, in God's life. And so it is happiness, but it's happiness insofar as we find ourselves like more and more wrapped in and united with the life of God. Like that's actually the fulfillment of our lives. And so in the book, I refer to beatitudo not as happiness mainly, but as participation in blessing, like God's blessedness, God's eternal blessedness. It's perfect in God's life, and we get to participate in that in the way that it's ours, but it's ours because God in grace has granted it to us. And so that's where we're headed. So everything that we do in our lives, like thinking like what career do I want to pursue? With whom do I want to be in relationship? How do I want to spend my Sunday afternoon? All of these are questions that we're in some way longing for the fulfillment that we can find in part in this life, but we find it ultimately, as we grow closer and closer to God and find it in our fulfillment in the life to come. And so this idea of like, we're always on a journey. We're always on a journey toward participation in blessing or toward beatitudo. What does it mean to travel well when there's very real challenges all around us? And I think that's the practical question that we always are asking ourselves.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love that. I think that's a point where we check in with ourselves and we check in with kind of where we really find ourselves and our passions and our alignments. I think that's something we talk a lot about, or at least John talks a lot around here at Chapelwood about, is what's at the center of our being and what's orbiting around that, and how other things get in the way of that. But at the same time, I also think about how, when we're participating in God's blessing, like as the church, that blessing to the people who have lost that sense of their identity, that label of whatever diagnosis has become too great or too big, and it's, you know what I mean? That's kind of a space where the idea to participate in blessing for those who are journeying with people in mental health is such a, I don't know, just a an invigorating idea. It really does kind of bring a lot of energy and joy to think about walking alongside.
Yeah. I'm gonna misquote this, but in his sermon, "The Weight of Glory," C.S. Lewis has a phrase that if you could only see, there might be a church sanctuary where people are sitting there and you think they're just sitting there, but if you could only see the majesty of these human beings as creatures and see them as God sees them, like they would be so like radiant, you'd be tempted to worship them.
Yeah.
He's not calling on us to do that. But he's saying like we don't see each other in the way that God sees us, as the kind of beautiful creatures that we are. And so to kind of strip away some of the ways in which we assign value in our society, and to see ourselves as those who are wayfarers, who are aiming toward God, who are made in the image of God. It's a way of like freeing us from kind of narratives of shame and of failure and of status that we just get so wrapped up in our culture, including in our church culture.
Yeah. Warren, like if you had a magic wand in a sense, and you were because you stand in both that place of kind of working with people that are experiencing really critical mental illness in ways that are quite acute. And you also have a foot in the church. Often it seems that the church has been a part of that denial process. It has not given practically determined places for people to come to grips or to belong. It often impedes that in some ways, so that you end up, I think some of the folks that I come in contact with who feel like they have to get a language game down to belong, you tell me what you believe, I'll tell you if you belong. And and underneath that, they're willing to say all manners of things in order to belong, because that's at the deepest part of us. If you could work with pastors, what are some things that you would want us to be oriented around as we work with folks, even within ourselves and our own families, of dealing with kind of different mental health issues? What would you want us to see that we don't see?
Yeah, let me speak as practically as possible, because I do think the church has a really important role to play in
I do too.
mental health issues in our culture. I think one thing is just to know that I really do believe that not all, certainly not all, but a lot of common mental health struggles have to do with challenges in relationships, with communities that are frayed and fractured, with a culture that is very polarized, and where there's a whole lot of media ecosystems that are constantly keeping us in a stage of fear and outrage, because that's how media companies make money, is to keep us in that state. And so nothing that happens in a clinician's office is going to be sustainable unless we can name the fact that a lot of our mental health problems in our culture are ecological and cultural. You have to do with how we live in communities. And so I think thinking about the church as like, what does it mean to be a kind of different kind of community? The book prepares people to live in the fractured, polarized, difficult world that we live in right now, but also helps to model a different way of being. So I think a few things. I think, and I'll get to the role of clinicians maybe in just a minute, but a few things is like, what does it mean to this is a hard thing to do, and I'm not a pastor, so I don't say it slightly, but what does it mean for each person who comes into a church building on a Sunday morning to have, at least briefly, someone looking at them and really taking their experience seriously? Even if it's like 3 to 5 minutes of the hour or 2 or 3 that somebody's in a church building, like, what does it mean to find ways for people to connect, so people don't come to church lonely and leave lonely and never have any like real human interaction with others? Like, so chances for connection. I think as many churches do, like especially larger churches, like finding smaller units of people to be connected with each other, whether that's a Sunday school class or a small group or a Bible study or a dinner conversation group, but some way for people to be connected in relationship. I think when people are going through crisis, not all crises can be handled, by the church alone. Lots of health crises, people need either mental health or broader healthcare help. But what churches can do is when people are facing crises, one, to have a culture where it's okay for people to talk about those,
right?
Which is fairly easy if you're facing a cancer diagnosis, maybe, but not so easy if you're facing substance use crisis or mental health problem. But a culture where people can talk about them, and then to surround people with following their lead, but to surround people with a group of people that are committed to walk with that person or that family in a time of crisis, and to pray for them, and to think about the material, logistical needs that they might have, and to commit to walk with them, until things are more stable. And of course, that might be walking with somebody through the process of dying.
Yes.
It might be walking with somebody through a substance use crisis and process of rehab, or whatever it is. But that means a lot, and that's not something that the medical system can replicate.
Yes.
I think building, as I know you all do, and many pastors do, like building connections with area therapists and mental health professionals, so that you kind of know like who people are that would be good fits, and when people are facing mental health crisis, is really helpful. And those relationships can go a long way. And I think for like therapists who might be listening to this, to like find intentional ways to connect with pastors, so that there can be that way of like being available, or at least knowing kind of how to refer people well when pastors are learning about things in their congregation and people need help. And I think also like knowing like when is it that like immediate professional help really is needed. And I think like serious thoughts of suicide is one example where, I mean, I'd say anyone who's listening right now who's having thoughts of suicide, get the help you deserve. That's right. and get it from somebody who has experience walking with people through crises, and call the National Suicide Crisis Line number at 988, and there's always somebody who can help. But get those kinds of helps. And so I think there are spaces when I think trained clinicians really do need to be involved, just because they have the experience to be able to walk with people through really dangerous and difficult times.
I love that. A couple of years ago, a therapist called me and said there's some folks in my practice that are feeling they've experienced spiritual abuse, and he created a group for some other things and asked me if I would come alongside and be kind of a spiritual this is director or advisor, which I don't know what to. So to be that to hold that space. And that space is really interesting for me, the combination between the expertise of a therapist and a pastor and the fluid language we were both using, but the fact that we were seeking and attempting to create a container of healing for people. There was something deeply powerful about that combination. Not as an idea, not where we were referring to each other as individuals, but creating a group around both mental health and spiritual dynamics. That I think that there's potential for that in the future, of that kind of border crossing that could be really powerful. You know?
I think that's right. Yeah. And I so respect, your own training in that area, Matt, where you kind of embody both mental health training and also pastoral training, and that is a really beautiful combination to be able specifically to help. Like, what does it mean to help create this kind of structures and containers where healing can happen?
That's why we want you to move to Houston, so we can do all this work together with you,
That's
Warren.
Right. Everything can happen in Houston.
Everything,
it's true.
You can teach now online, so just get your butt here. Let's go.
Houston is an amazing city. Yeah.
Have you run across? I wanted to ask you this because I find it to be really interesting. Saint Dymphna, I think is her name. I just read about her a couple years ago and have been very interested in this story. Do you know the story? And if you do, could well, Saint Dymphna, we don't know much about her life except what's come to us in medieval legend. But it's a both horrible and beautiful story altogether. So Saint Dymphna was an Irish
woman, a princess who the story tells us actually was being abused by her father in Ireland.
Yes.
And ended up leaving Ireland, finding her way, across the sea, and ended up settling in what's now Belgium, in a town that is spelled Gheel, and I think the pronunciation is typically Hale. And she ended up there, and the story goes that her father actually tracked her down and killed her. There's this terrible story of abuse and violence. And when Daphne was interred, where she was buried, it became a pilgrimage site in the Middle Ages, and people began to come to her grave to seek healing. It became a kind of shrine, so a church was built around it. And by the time you got to I think it was 1200s, 1300s, people would come to that village with what we would now consider intellectual disability or chronic forms of mental illness, and they would show up and seek healing. And the farmers around, the people in the community, began to say, we have these folks who are coming seeking healing at this shrine, and they're staying around. How can we actually incorporate them into our households? And so they began a tradition of basically foster care hospitality, where they invited people in to work the fields, but also to live in their homes and to be part of their extended households. And this tradition started in the Middle Ages, but it's continued in modern form until this very day.
Yes.
There's still families in Hale who take people into their homes with severe and persistent mental illness. And historians actually look at this village as the birthplace of community mental health care.
Yes.
And so it's just such a lovely story of of Christian people who were not educated, but they knew something about the gospel. They knew something about hospitality, and they knew something about caring for others. And they began to invite people into their community in a way that really has changed not only the course of that community, but changed the course of mental health care.
Yes.
Through the centuries.
Yeah.
It's just a lovely story.
Yeah.
Out of a very terrible origin tale.
Right. I find so much hope in that, right? Supposedly even today there's like 250, they don't call them patients, they call them boarders or pilgrims or guests. And they're just, they've absorbed these folks into their very homes, right? For as much time as, I just think there's something like very practically beautiful about that I think, I wonder if the church, how do we do that? We have to. Yeah.
It's hard, and I'm not trying to simplify it, but I mean, you think about the largest institution caring for people with severe mental illness in Houston is the Harris County Jail.
The jail.
Yeah.
And there are a huge number of others who are unhoused or housing insecure, and of course, then there's other family care homes and other kinds of things. But we have this incredibly fractured patchwork set of institutions and places that are capable of offering hospitality. And so I think we can learn something from Hale, not as something that you just snap your fingers and it happens, but like what are opportunities that we have to invite people into our churches, into our households, into our places of employment, where they can find a sense of like, this is who I am, and this is what my life makes sense because I have these people that I can depend on and work to do, and a sense of my life having a certain kind of purpose. And I think being able to call people into vocation and purpose is really important for all of us, including for people with serious mental illness.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. What 3 books are you reading right now that are having an impact on the way you're thinking or the way you're processing or the depth that you're attempting to live out of? Yeah,
well, maybe 3 different kind of things. I read, I'm just beginning this biography by Tia Miles of Harriet Tubman called Night Flyer that talks about Harriet Tubman's just tenacious faith that allowed her to become the kind of freedom fighter that she became. And that's of interest to me. I've mostly just finished Ian McGilchrist's big new book called The Matter of Things. That he's a psychiatrist who talks about right and left brain ways of being in the world. And that book has kind of shaken me. I don't agree with all of its philosophical presuppositions, but it's it's a really great read. I have to say, it's a long read, but it's good. And then I read, in the kind of Christian genre, I just read a little book by Alan Noble this summer called On Getting Out of Bed. It's probably 10 or 20,000 words, but he writes in a very kind of like just hard-hitting way about his own experience of like engaging suffering. And I found it actually a really helpful read because he talks about like suffering is a fact of life, and how do we live with it and deal with it, but to do so in the context of the Christian story. And I found it a really helpful read, and one that I've been recommending to others.
That's great. On getting out of bed, I'm going to hand that to my 17-year-old tomorrow.
That's right. That's
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
I need all the help I can get.
Yeah.
Warren, thanks so much for being with us
we
today.
appreciate you so much.
Thank you all. Yeah, it's really good to see both of you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, we hope to reconnect with you in the not so distant future. So yeah, thank you.
That's great. Sounds good.
All
Good.
right. Blessings.
Good to see both of you. Thanks so
All right,
much.
you too.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
That's one smart hombre right there. I mean, the work he's done both in the medical field and then also his attunement to the church, I find to be, a real blessing.
I like you said, finding people who are willing to cross borders to get out of silos that kind of exist in our economy and to see, the way that God is at work in those places, and the ways in which the creativity and the life-giving, Spirit of God exists.
Yeah.
When we're able to pull ourselves away from what we think is our lane.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's good to have experts that we trust and rely on, but so much more happens when we're in the room together.
Yeah, that's right.
Than apart.
That's right. That's right. And I hope that we're moving to an era, both within our culture and church and those things, where mental health, we talk about that as like the new normal is no one is normal. Right? As if
Speak for yourself.
maybe you're the benchmark for that, Andrew. But I mean that we all are struggling with something. We're all carrying something around, and that we have a culture that really necessitates us or asks us not to show that, to talk about that, and then we wonder why we drink so much, or that we can't quit our, the schedules we pack full of things. Right? We create these defense systems.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a different way of living, a better way of.
Yeah. I mean, and it's so often it feels as though it's up to me to master it. It's so inwardly focused about the individual overcoming or mastering or whatever we're telling ourselves. And I just don't know if that's true. Like, I don't find that to be true.
No.
That more life-giving, more meaning is found when I am in a community, when I'm surrounded with people that I can deeply trust, when I am, with my immediate family. There's so much more that gives me excitement and energy and purpose than just the simple, like, I'm going to climb this ladder and I'm going to keep going. And when I get this or that thing in the way that is just stopping me, then I have to just power through it on my own.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And I don't know how we get to that shift.
Yeah.
But I think it begins with community. I
Yeah.
think it begins with not relying upon ourselves or our own ways of salvation.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the ways I've learned that is kind of in the programs of recovery in some of the rooms I've been able to hang out with, where they talk about that to recover, and not just from, a substance or behaviors, but really to recover our own humanity. It's a we program, not a me program.
Yeah.
And so I think being relentlessly pursuing being in a group somewhere where people are tuned to each other in tender ways is like a non-negotiable. And so if you're needing a group, we've got groups like that at Chapelwood. There's groups all over the city, men's groups, women's groups, couples, all those. There's resources, but we have to, I think, reach out for those resources in order to heal. And it always, I think, is a move towards knowing and being known in that space. It's great having Warren on. Great to see you. If you like the podcast, and we encourage you to subscribe to it, to like it, to love it, to tell your friends about it, and we'll see you. John will be probably back next week, and again, Andrew, we're just delighted that you're here. I'm Matt Russell.
I'm Andrew Wolf.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.